When I hear the songs that teach us about America, I think about our heritage, and I'm so thankful that we are indeed Americans, aren't you? I'm delighted to introduce at this time another great hero of the faith who travels all over this country. And I don't know how he retains all of this information that he gives out, but he is a walking historian. And we've had the privilege of going through the United States Capitol building with David Barton on numerous occasions. And I'm amazed at his ability to point out our Judeo-Christian history here in this country. And God has his hands on him and is greatly using him. And I know you'll be blessed, and I want to encourage you to welcome right now David Barton of Wallbuilders.
Great to be with you. We are a blessed people with all the things that we have to fight and all the things we look at. There's 192 nations in the world today, and we are the only nation in the world that has not averaged a revolution every 20 to 30 years. There is something to America that is called American exceptionalism. We are different from other nations, and it's because of the principles on which we were founded. Those principles were set forth in the Declaration, secured in the Constitution. They started with the premise that we are built upon the laws of nature and of the God who created the laws of nature. That from those laws we learn, first off, there is a creator God, that it is creator God and not government who gives specific rights to people, that government exists to protect the rights that God has given, and that below those God-given rights, we have the consent of the governed. The people get to choose what they want below those God-given rights. Now, those are the fundamental principles of our government. That's what we've had. That's what we've secured. That's the way we operate. And under inalienable rights and under also the laws of nature and of nature's God, marriage between a man and a woman clearly fits every specific definition. Therefore, it is the purpose of government to protect those rights. If they don't want to, the least they can do is let the consent of the governed have their voice on it. So either way it goes, it should come back to the people. Actually, the government should do it without having to take it back to the people. But if they won't, bring it back to the people. We'll make that decision. Now, you've heard there's been 30 states that have already done this. What's amazing is the average passing rate of all 30 states combined is just below 70%. Now, 70% is no small amount. I mean, find something else that 70% of Americans agree on. 70% of Americans agreeing on anything is a massive number. So we have these massive numbers, and yet we have difficulty passing marriage amendments like here in North Carolina. Now, why would that be? Well, when this came up at the U.S. Congress a couple years ago, we had the marriage amendment vote there. The LA Times at that time reported that 72% of the nation supported marriage as being between a man and a woman, wanted it defined and wanted it protected. So came time for that vote on a Thursday in the House and the Senate. We were looking at phone calls that had been coming in, and when it came time to the vote, we found that more phone calls had come in at that period of time demanding asbestos protection than marriage protection. And we looked at that and said, what happened? 72% of the nation wants to protect marriage. They say they do, but nobody's really calling their legislators to do anything. So at that point in time, a number of the congressmen commissioned polls to say, okay, what happened? Why was there a breakdown between the high level support and the lack of activity from the people going after the legislators? And what they found was that although 72% of the nation says that we want marriage as a man and a woman, 62% of the nation said, but even if it doesn't happen, it's not going to affect me. Even if homosexual marriage goes through, it's not going to have an impact. I mean, if homosexual marriage goes through, myself, my wife, Cheryl, we're going to stay married. It's not going to have an impact on us. So 62% of the people had an attitude of kind of live and let live. It's really not going to affect me if we don't get it protected. And that's where it's really helpful to look at the other 9 nations in the world that have already gone to homosexual marriage or the equivalent thereof. Several of them have been there for several decades, and it's easy to get stats now. And what we find is that you look, Canada has gone to the equivalent homosexual marriage, as has Spain, as has England, as has the Scandinavian countries, as has Netherlands, etc. So we can look at them and say, okay, what's happened in the culture when they did not protect traditional marriage? What we find is that not having done that, they gave homosexuals the right to marry. Now, homosexuals in America run between 1.6 and 1.9% of the population. In those countries have been giving homosexuals the right to marry. Only 2% of homosexuals chose to marry once given the right. So what we've done is redefine a 5,000-year-old institution on the basis of 2% of 2%. Then having redefined it for that tiny, tiny, tiny percent, what happened was the average homosexual marriage in those countries lasted only 18 months, and it involved 8 extramarital partners. Now, even in America, where we have high divorce rates, we talk with marriage in terms of years and not months, and we don't talk in terms of 8 extramarital partners. So what happened in those nations was everybody observing that and said, that's marriage, is it? Nah, it doesn't look like very much to me. So what they found in those nations was respect for marriage went away, and as a result, on average, in those nations that have adopted homosexual marriage or the equivalent thereof, the out-of-wedlock birth rate has increased 46%. Now, when you start increasing that 46%, you start affecting your culture. For example, in America, every year we spend $112 billion on the effects of out-of-wedlock births. Well, let's just add another 46% to that. Let's just pay more out of our pockets for that. And by the way, even the social effects. I've been a consultant for years at the consultant pool of the U.S. Justice Department. We know that 90% of all violent crimes over the last 2 decades have been committed by children who are raised in non-traditional homes, homes without a mother and a father. So let's just increase our justice spending by another 90% on top, because that's where that problem comes from. 75% of all juvenile crime comes from kids who are raised in non-traditional homes without a mother and a father. When we go through the social consequences are absolutely huge. So what's happened in those nations, they say, you know, marriage doesn't mean much, so we're not going to pay attention to marriage. They cannot now pay for the consequences of having weakened marriage. Denmark has a 68% tax rate in Denmark, and that doesn't even count their withholding tax. They cannot pay for the consequence of what's happened. England now reports for the first time in its recorded history it has the lowest marriage rate in its history, and that's an old nation. They've been around there for centuries and centuries. They now have the lowest marriage rate. They are starting to fall apart. In America, as we've started seeing this mentality grow of tolerance toward all things, we now know that in the last 15 years, the marriage rate in America has decreased 29% just in the last 15 years. And if you haven't noticed, the federal government has just undertaken, it seems so oxymoronic to be here trying to protect marriage, and the federal government has just undertaken a massive spending program. You'll start seeing ads on TV trying to promote the benefits of marriage because they want to quit spending money on all the problems they're having from weakening marriage. Now, so it's kind of oxymoronic that the feds are starting to say, wait a minute, maybe we've got, even though the president's still going one direction, from the previous administration we had these programs already in place trying to benefit marriage. So there is a difference. What you have to do is you have to let the people living around you know that if we don't protect marriage, it is going to affect you. It's going to affect your pocketbook. It's going to affect the crime that happens in your neighborhood. It's going to affect everything. This is not a live and let live situation. This is something that affects the fundamental basis of a culture. Now, on top of that, what we've had with this is we now are at a point where we want to see something done here in North Carolina. So what do we do with all that? Well, a couple things that have to happen, and you've already heard some of it today. You got to talk to legislatures. You need to very respectfully lobby legislators. You have to tell them, look, this is what we need, and they're going to say, you know, we really can't do it. It's been assigned to committee, and the speaker's already done that. Do not let them off the hook on that. They're the ones who choose the speaker, and they can get the speaker to change their mind anytime they put the pressure on him. But they won't put the pressure on him till they feel the pressure on themselves. They would just as soon hide behind the speaker and his assignment to committee and let it be the end of it, and then that way they don't have pressure. Do not let them off the hook with that. Let me give you a great example. Kansas faced the same situation you guys are facing right now. The legislators there would not move to protect marriage. Pastors, other groups met at the Capitol, big rallies, lobbied. Legislators wouldn't do it. They took names of the legislators who refused to aggressively, actively go after it. And I will tell you that in Kansas, the next election, they threw out 44 incumbents out of the legislature in Kansas. Now, guess what the first act of the next legislative session was? First thing was they passed a marriage amendment. That is where the consent of the governed does come into play. You don't have to stop this just because it can't go through a committee. You just simply replace the legislators and get guys in there who will move the thing through committee. But that only happens if you will let your neighbors know that this is something that affects you. This is not just a legislative battle that goes on in Raleigh at the state capitol. This is something that comes to your neighborhood. So we have to get that 62% who think that marriage, it doesn't matter which way it goes. I support it, but it's not that big a deal. Those are the people we have to touch and reach. And you've already heard, don't call your legislators just today. Call them once a week and pour this thing on. Let them hear time after time after time. Let them feel the heat till they see the light. God bless you guys. Thanks for showing up today.